the 14th century, Europe was gripped by a plague so devastating that it seemed to tear the veil between the living and the dead. The Black Death swept through towns and villages, leaving streets lined with the dead and air heavy with grief. Whole families vanished overnight, their homes abandoned, their lives erased. It wasn't just the bodies that were buried. Fear, despair, and whispers of the supernatural settled into the soil alongside them. In a world ruled by death, the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual frayed. The plague was more than a disease. It was an apocalyptic reckoning, a force that brought humanity face to face with its own fragility. Shadows grew longer in its wake, and across the devastated landscape, stories began to take shape. Restless spirits, cursed places, and haunting visions became part of the collective memory, passed from survivor to survivor in hushed tones. Were these tales a means to explain the unexplainable, or did something more sinister linger in the aftermath of such profound suffering? The Black Death left scars that transcended the physical. Even today, the echoes of that dark time remain. In churchyards and plague pits, in abandoned homes and windswept fields, legends persist of ghosts that refuse to rest, cursed relics tied to the outbreak, and places forever marked by tragedy. What is it about this particular moment in history that bred so many haunting tales? Did the sheer magnitude of death open a door to something beyond? This is the story of the Black Death's ghostly legacy, a journey into the shadows left by one of humanity's darkest chapters. From chilling folktales to eerie historical accounts, we'll explore how the plague shaped not only the world of the living, but also the realm of the dead. The Black Death began quietly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. By the mid-14th century, Europe was already reeling from food shortages, economic instability, and the lingering scars of war. Trade routes stretched farther than ever before, bringing silk and spices from the east, but along with them came an unseen passenger. In 1346, reports emerged of a mysterious illness spreading in the Mongol-controlled steppes of Central Asia. The disease travelled westward, hitching rides on caravans, merchant ships and armies, arriving in Crimea by the autumn of that year. From there it crossed the Mediterranean, carried by Genoese ships fleeing a besieged trading port, and reached Europe's shores. The plague struck with devastating speed. It took hold first in Sicily in 1347, then crept through Italy's bustling ports before sweeping across the continent. Cities fell silent as commerce halted, and rural villages were left as hushed graveyards, their inhabitants gone. No class, no region, and no age was spared. Survivors who walked among the dead carried more than grief. They bore the weight of a world turned unrecognizably dark. At first, society clung to familiar responses, but these quickly proved futile. Physicians wore their infamous beaked masks, packed with herbs and spices to ward off the miasma, or bad air, believed to spread the disease. Fires were lit in city squares to purify the air, and streets were cleansed with vinegar. Yet no remedy slowed the tide. Quarantines were imposed in cities like Venice, where incoming ships were held offshore for 40 days. 40 giorni, a practice that would give us the modern word quarantine. Still, the measures were too late, too scattered, and too ineffective to contain the invisible killer. The disease defied explanation, striking the pious and the sinful, the wealthy and the poor without distinction. Its symptoms were horrifying: swollen lymph nodes or buboes that turned black and oozed pus, fever so high it drove some to madness, and an agonizing death that often came within days. The speed and savagery of the plague shattered the medieval worldview, which had long been anchored in the belief that life was divinely ordered and predictable. In this void, explanations for the horror were desperately sought. The natural world, already mysterious to medieval minds, became even more terrifying. Could the air itself be poisoned, they wondered, by strange mists or the rancid stench of death? The Church, long seen as the intermediary between God and man, pointed to sin. This was no mere pestilence, it preached. It was punishment. The plague was divine retribution for a humanity that had strayed too far from grace. With each funeral pyre that lit the night sky, these fears deepened, giving birth to beliefs that blurred the line between faith and superstition. Religious fervour burned brighter in the darkness. The flagellants, bands of wandering penitents, became a chilling sight on Europe's roads. Stripped to the waist, they processed through towns and villages, rhythmically lashing their backs with scourges tipped with iron spikes. Their songs and chants mixed with cries of pain, a visceral demonstration of humanity's supposed guilt. Onlookers often joined in, believing the flagellant's suffering could help atone for collective sins. But such acts often descended into chaos, with flagellant groups condemning priests and inciting riots against those they deemed unworthy of salvation. Their movement was eventually condemned by the Church, but not before it left a trail of bloody fervour across the continent. Amid this landscape of despair, scapegoats emerged. The Jewish communities of Europe bore the brunt of this misplaced rage. Already subjected to centuries of marginalisation, they were accused of poisoning wells or conspiring to spread the plague. In 1349, the city of Strasbourg witnessed one of the most infamous acts of this hysteria. Hundreds of Jewish men, women, and children were burned alive in a public square. Entire communities were destroyed, their existence erased not by disease, but by fear turned to violence. Women, too, faced deadly scrutiny. Accusations of witchcraft, often thinly veiled excuses for social or political rivalries, soared during the plague years. A woman who lived alone or practiced herbal medicine might be accused of summoning the pestilence through dark pacts. Inquisition records from plague-stricken towns detail exorcisms performed on suspected witches, their confessions often extracted through torture. For those desperate to make sense of the chaos, the blame had to rest somewhere, and the plague provided fertile ground for the persecution of the vulnerable. Beyond the human realm, the plague transformed the way people saw death itself. Improper burials became a necessity as the sheer volume of corpses overwhelmed traditions. Mass graves were hastily dug, the dead interred without last rites or individual prayers. For a society deeply invested in the sanctity of burial rituals, this disruption was more than a practical crisis. It was a spiritual one. The unburied dead were thought to become restless, their spirits unable to move on. Folklore exploded with tales of such spirits, unquiet souls tethered to the places of their untimely deaths. In plague-stricken Venice, Poveglia Island became a site of such dread. Used as a quarantine station, its grounds became saturated with the remains of plague victims, tales of spectral figures wandering the island at night. Their cries carried on the wind became part of its haunted legend, a place so burdened by death that the living feared to set foot on it. Fear didn't merely reside in physical places, it rewrote landscapes entirely. Fields once lush with crops became barren and ominous, believed cursed by the weight of so many hasty burials. Rivers and wells were said to carry the plague's essence, becoming symbols of corruption. Even the air seemed cursed, thick with the smoke of burning bodies and the acrid scent of despair. These perceptions, rooted in the collective trauma of the time, gave rise to a belief that the land itself was sick, a victim of the devastation alongside its inhabitants. At its heart, the Black Death was a story of loss of life, of faith, of the fragile equilibrium that held the medieval world together. Yet it also became a story of fear given form. Restless spirits, cursed lands, and vengeful forces woven into the narrative of survival. The legacy of those years is not just the millions who perished, but the shadows they left behind, haunting the imagination of the living. The Black Death didn't merely claim lives, it erased entire communities, turning once thriving villages into hushed ruins. Across Europe, these ghost villages became silent witnesses to a history too grim to fully bury. Over time, whispers of hauntings crept into their crumbling walls, stories of spirits bound to the land where they had perished, tethered by fear, loss, and unfinished business. One of the most haunting examples is Warham Percy, a medieval village in North Yorkshire, England. Before the plague, Warham Percy was a bustling farming community, its fertile lands feeding generations. But when the Black Death struck, the village fell into despair. By the 16th century, it was abandoned entirely, its population wiped out by a combination of disease, famine, and economic collapse. Archaeological digs have unearthed chilling evidence, mass graves hastily dug for plague victims, and the charred remains of bodies thought to be mutilated after death. Historians speculate that this was an act of desperation, a belief that mutilating corpses might prevent their spirits from rising. Today, visitors to Warham Percy report an oppressive silence, broken only by the faint rustle of wind through overgrown churchyards. Some claim to see spectral figures wandering among the ruins, their movements slow and deliberate, as if searching for something lost. Others speak of whispers carried on the wind, voices too faint to understand but too persistent to ignore. The village's grim history and the legends it inspired make it a powerful symbol of how the Black Death left scars that bled into the supernatural. Eyam, another English village, carries a story not of abandonment but of extraordinary sacrifice. Known as the Plague Village, Eyam became a site of self-imposed quarantine during the Great Plague of 1665. When a tailor's assistant unwittingly brought the disease to the village in a shipment of cloth, the townsfolk, led by their rector, made the unthinkable decision to cut themselves off from the outside world to prevent the plague's spread. They endured unimaginable suffering, with entire families succumbing to the disease while their neighbours left food and supplies at the village's edge, terrified to come closer. Eyam's courage inspired legends of spectral guardians, spirits said to protect the village from future calamities. Some visitors claim to see ghostly figures watching over the old boundary stones where supplies were once exchanged. Others describe an eerie glow emanating from the graves of plague victims at night, as if the spirits themselves are keeping vigil. The tale of Eyam stands as a haunting reminder of how the Black Death etched its presence into both history and folklore. Beyond these villages lie the broader legends of the dead, ghostly figures whose origins are tied to the plague but whose stories have grown into chilling archetypes. One such legend is that of the White Lady, a spectral figure that appears across Europe in various forms. Often depicted as a mourning woman, she is said to be the spirit of a mother who lost her children to the plague. In Germany, tales of the Weiße Frau describe her as both a harbinger of death and a tragic figure, weeping for lives lost too soon. She is often seen near ancient plague pits, her pale figure glowing faintly in the moonlight, a vision both sorrowful and terrifying. The Plague Doctor, too, has transcended history to become an enduring symbol of the era's fear and mystery. While the image of the bird-like mask is rooted in fact, designed to protect physicians from the miasma thought to spread disease, stories of spectral plague doctors have emerged in the centuries since. In regions where plague pits were hastily dug, people have reported sightings of figures wearing long cloaks and the iconic beaked masks, moving silently through the night. These apparitions are said to vanish when approached, leaving behind a suffocating chill, as if the air itself remembers the death they once presided over. Blending these historical roots with folklore creates a potent narrative of grief, fear, and unresolved trauma. The tales of restless spirits like the White Lady and the Plague Doctor serve as metaphors for the plague's lingering impact. They embody the loss and despair of a time when death was omnipresent, and humanity struggled to find meaning in its shadow. To these ghostly archetypes, we can add the local stories that pepper Europe's plague-stricken lands. In Italy, the haunted villages of Tuscany tell of spectral children heard laughing and playing in abandoned buildings, an eerie juxtaposition to the silence left by the plague. In France, old inns along once busy trade routes are said to be haunted by the spirits of travellers who died far from home, their ethereal cries echoing through crumbling halls. The ghosts of the plague are not confined to abandoned villages and haunting archetypes. They also live in the detailed folklore of communities, where stories passed from generation to generation have taken on a life of their own. These tales, rooted in the plague's horrors, often blur the lines between memory and myth, turning historical suffering into spectral warnings. In Bavaria, a particularly chilling legend recounts the Dance of the Dead. It is said that during the height of the plague, villagers gathered in desperation to plead with divine forces for mercy. When no answer came, some turned to darker means, summoning spirits or even demons to intervene. Folklore holds that in one such village the dead rose to join the living in a ghastly dance, their skeletal forms swaying to an unseen rhythm. The survivors fled, leaving the village to be consumed by darkness. Centuries later, travellers who stumbled upon the ruins claimed to hear faint music and see shadowy figures twirling among the trees, as if the dance had never ended. Similarly, in Scandinavia, the lore of the Plague Maiden has endured. This spectral figure, often depicted as a pale woman in black, was believed to travel from village to village, spreading death wherever she went. Some stories suggest she carried a broom or rake, symbols of her deadly power. If she swept with the broom, every soul in the village would perish. If she used the rake, a few might survive. Villagers were said to leave offerings at crossroads or burn fires at their boundaries, hoping to ward off her arrival. These traditions reveal the lengths to which communities went to make sense of the senseless, wrapping their fears in the protective cloak of storytelling. The folklore surrounding plague pits is equally chilling. These mass graves, hastily dug and often unmarked, became sites of eerie power. In Poland, one legend tells of the Black Earth, soil taken from plague pits that was said to curse anyone who touched it. Farmers near Krakow spoke of crops failing on fields tainted by plague burials, the earth itself refusing to yield to the living. Even today, some villagers avoid building near these sites, fearing that disturbing the ground might awaken the spirits of the restless dead. But it wasn't only the earth that bore the plague's scars. It was the very air. Stories of the plague wind circulated across Europe, describing a foul-smelling breeze that heralded death. This belief, tied to the miasma theory of disease, took on supernatural dimensions. Travellers caught in these winds were said to hear faint whispers or feel unseen hands clawing at their clothes. Even in modern times, those exploring ruins of plague-stricken villages sometimes report strange gusts that seem to defy natural patterns, as if the wind itself carries the memories of those who perished. Such stories are not mere relics of the past. They have shaped how we perceive the plague's legacy even today. Ghost tours of plague-stricken cities like Prague and London often include these legends, blending historical fact with the supernatural to captivate modern audiences. In Venice, guides recount tales of Poveglia Island, where the soil is said to be 50% human ash. In Edinburgh, the infamous Mary King's Close, a narrow underground street sealed off during the plague, is the setting for numerous ghost sightings, including spectral children who tug at visitors' clothing. These accounts serve a dual purpose. They remind us of the human cost of the Black Death, but they also act as a kind of living folklore, keeping the memory of those who suffered alive in the present. The boundaries between history and myth blur in these tales, reflecting a universal need to make sense of devastation. They are, in their way, a form of resilience, a way for the living to reclaim some measure of power over a tragedy that once felt unstoppable. In the ruins of Warham Percy, in the quarantined boundaries of Iam, and in the shadowy alleys of medieval cities, the ghosts of the plague remain. They are not just phantoms of the dead, but echoes of a time when humanity stood on the brink, its survival uncertain. The stories they inspire, of ghost villages, spectral figures and cursed lands, remind us that the past is never truly gone. It lingers, waiting to be remembered in the quiet places where the living fear to tread. The plague left scars not only on the bodies of its victims but also on the land itself. Villages abandoned during the Black Death became shrouded in whispers of curses, places where the soil was said to remember too much death. Recurring outbreaks in the same regions deepened these fears, as if the earth itself had turned against its inhabitants, refusing to let life flourish again. In the Pyrenees, nestled between France and Spain, lies the abandoned village of Montaillou. Once a thriving community, it became synonymous with doom when the plague swept through, taking nearly every life within its borders. Survivors who fled spoke of the air growing thick and heavy, of a palpable sense of dread that lingered long after the last body fell. Local legends claim the village was cursed by heretics burned at the stake decades earlier, their final cries echoing as a warning of divine retribution. Even today, the ruins are avoided, the ground left untrodden by shepherds and travellers alike. Further north, the village of Easdale in England tells a similar story. Ravaged by the plague, Easdale was abandoned and later struck by a series of landslides that buried its remains beneath the hills. Villagers in neighbouring towns claimed the disasters were the earth's punishment, a sign that Easdale had been marked. Stories persist of ghostly lights flickering on the hillside, as if the spirits of the dead are trapped beneath the stones, searching for a way out. The idea of cursed lands wasn't limited to abandoned villages. Fields used for plague pits became symbols of death's dominion. In Hungary, the legend of the Black Grove warns of a forest where plague victims were buried en masse. Locals claimed the trees grew darker and gnarled, their branches twisted unnaturally. No birds sang there, and travellers who ventured into its depths often returned stricken with fever, or didn't return at all. Though science might point to the spread of disease from contaminated soil, the stories persisted, weaving nature into the fabric of the supernatural. Natural disasters that followed the plague only reinforced the belief in curses. Earthquakes, floods, and failed harvests were seen not as coincidences but as consequences. In Italy's Emilia-Romagna region, the town of Cento faced recurring bouts of plague and devastating floods. A local tale claims that the town's founders angered an ancient spirit by building on sacred ground. Each outbreak, each flood, was said to be the spirit's revenge, a grim reminder of humanity's hubris. These cursed places weren't just seen as sites of tragedy, they became warnings. The stories told about them carried a dual purpose: to explain the unexplainable and to deter others from trespassing on land believed to hold death's grip. The Black Death turned ordinary places into shadowed landscapes, their very soil imbued with the weight of fear and loss. The fear of curses naturally bled into something darker, the belief that the plague was not just a natural calamity, but a deliberate act of malice, orchestrated by witches and demons. Medieval minds sought culprits, and in the chaos of the plague, the line between the earthly and the infernal blurred. Across Europe, accusations of witchcraft soared during and after the plague years. In the Rhineland, a 14th century trial detailed the supposed confessions of women who claimed, under torture, to have summoned the plague through pacts with the devil. They spoke of rituals performed in moonlit fields, of potions brewed to infect entire villages. Whether or not these confessions held any truth, they fed into a growing hysteria that linked disease to dark forces. Church records from France reveal a chilling pattern. Priests called to perform exorcisms in towns racked by the plague reported visions of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of homes, figures they described as demonic. In one case from Avignon, a cleric wrote of a spectral being that hovered near a child's deathbed, its presence causing the family to flee in terror. Such accounts, though likely exaggerated or influenced by the stress of the times, reinforced the idea that the plague was more than physical. It was a spiritual invasion. The connection between witchcraft and the plague often centered on women who lived on the fringes of society. Healers and midwives, who had long served as vital figures in rural communities, suddenly found themselves targets. Their knowledge of herbs and remedies, once respected, was recast as evidence of dark powers. In Salem, Switzerland, a group of women accused of using their skills to spread the plague were executed after villagers claimed to have seen them walking through the streets carrying small, sinister bags of powder. The imagery of demons grew stronger in art and literature during this time. The plague itself was often depicted as a monstrous figure, a skeletal being draped in shadow, stalking its victims with unerring precision. These depictions reinforced the belief that the disease had an otherworldly origin, a punishment sent by Satan or a test allowed by God to purge the sinful. This obsession with demonic forces also manifested in rituals meant to combat them. Villages performed mass blessings of homes, livestock, and water sources, invoking saints and angels to ward off the devil's influence. Bonfires were lit at crossroads to burn out malevolent spirits, and charms were worn to repel demonic possession. Yet these measures often gave way to violence when fear reached its peak, and the execution of suspected witches became a grim spectacle that offered no real protection from the plague. The figure of death, robed and skeletal, became one of the most enduring symbols to emerge from the Black Death's shadow. Though depictions of death had existed in art and literature before, the plague brought a new and terrifying clarity to its imagery. No longer a mere concept, death was given form. A hooded spectre wielding a scythe, stalking the land and claiming victims indiscriminately. The origins of the Grim Reaper archetype can be traced to the plague years where its iconography first took hold in Europe's collective consciousness. The scythe, a tool of harvest, reflected the mass scale of death wrought by the plague. Just as farmers cut down fields of wheat, death's scythe swept through cities and villages, leaving devastation in its wake. The skeleton, a stark reminder of mortality, symbolized the inevitability of death, a truth the plague had made impossible to ignore. Art played a crucial role in cementing this archetype. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a recurring theme in murals, engravings, and manuscripts. These works depicted skeletal figures leading kings, peasants, clergy, and children alike in a macabre procession, underscoring the plague's unrelenting impartiality. The danse macabre wasn't just art, it was a message, a grim reminder that death spared no one. In folklore, death was no longer just a distant presence. It was an active participant in human lives. Stories of spectral figures seen walking through plague-stricken villages, counting the doors of those marked for death, became common. These tales gave the Reaper a voice and a purpose, personifying the fear that gripped a world in chaos. Over time, this image of death would evolve, but its roots in the Black Death remain unmistakable. The shadow of the Black Death lingers in ways both tangible and spectral. Across Europe, sites of plague mass burials, quarantine stations, and abandoned villages have become hotspots for paranormal encounters, drawing investigators and curious thrill-seekers alike. These places, marked by unimaginable suffering, seem to echo the anguish of those who perished there centuries ago. One of the most infamous of these haunted sites is Poveglia Island in Venice, a place drenched in both death and legend. During the Black Death, the island served as a quarantine station where the infected were sent to die. Bodies were piled into mass graves and burned in pyres, and it's estimated that over 100,000 people perished there. Today, the soil of Poveglia is said to be composed largely of human ash, a grim testament to its past. Paranormal investigators who have visited Poveglia report chilling phenomena, disembodied voices echoing through the ruins, shadowy figures moving just beyond sight, and an oppressive feeling of despair that descends upon anyone who lingers too long. One investigator recounted hearing faint cries of agony in the dead of night, accompanied by the sound of footsteps on gravel, though no one was there. Another described the sensation of being pushed by unseen hands near the island's plague pits. These reports, combined with its dark history, have earned Poveglia the nickname the Island of Ghosts. In England, similar stories surround old plague pits, particularly in London. Charterhouse Square, an unassuming green space in the heart of the city, was once a mass burial site for thousands of plague victims. Residents and passers-by have reported ghostly apparitions at dusk, figures in tattered clothes, their faces gaunt and hollow, vanishing as suddenly as they appear. Some claim to hear faint whispers rising from the ground, as though the dead are trying to tell their stories. These experiences have drawn ghost hunters armed with thermal cameras and EMF detectors, many of whom claim to capture evidence of unexplained presences. Even the relatively modern world of archaeology has not been immune to unsettling discoveries. In Bavaria, an excavation of a medieval plague cemetery revealed a chilling detail. Several of the skeletons had been pinned down with heavy stones, a practice believed to prevent the dead from rising. One archaeologist reported an overwhelming sense of unease while working at the site, as though unseen eyes were watching. Similar practices have been discovered in plague burial sites across Europe, lending credence to the idea that fear of the restless dead was not just folklore, but a real concern for medieval communities. Across the Atlantic, plague-related hauntings have also surfaced in unexpected places. In New York City, ghost stories surround Washington Square Park, a former burial ground for yellow fever victims. Though not directly tied to the Black Death, the park's history of mass death evokes similar tales of spectral wanderers and unexplained phenomena. Paranormal investigators claim to have recorded ghostly laughter and sobbing, further cementing the idea that places marked by mass death carry a unique weight. The effort to uncover the physical remnants of the Black Death has often been accompanied by eerie discoveries. In the small village of Thornton Abbey in Lincolnshire, England, archaeologists unearthed a mass grave containing over 48 bodies, believed to be victims of the plague. Among the remains were 2 children, buried side by side, their hands intertwined. This poignant detail raised questions. Was it a gesture of comfort in their final moments, or an act of hope by the living to preserve some humanity amidst chaos? Other discoveries have been even more unsettling. In Venice, near the site of the infamous plague pits, archaeologists found a skull with a brick wedged in its mouth. This was likely an attempt to prevent the so-called vampire plague, a superstition that blamed the spread of disease on the restless dead rising to feed on the living. These rituals, far from being isolated, reflect a widespread belief that the dead had to be controlled even in their graves. In addition to these physical artifacts, archaeologists have reported strange occurrences during their work. At a dig in Norwich, England, researchers cataloguing plague-era skeletons described inexplicable equipment failures and a recurring sensation of cold despite the summer heat. One team member claimed to hear faint voices while working near a burial trench, a phenomenon dismissed as imagination, but eerily consistent with other accounts from similar sites. These findings provide a chilling glimpse into the fears that gripped medieval Europe. They also highlight how deeply the trauma of the Black Death shaped beliefs about death and the afterlife. Each uncovered grave, each artifact serves as a fragment of a larger story, one that bridges the gap between history and the enduring mysteries of the human spirit. The Black Death was more than a biological catastrophe. It left scars on the psyche of survivors, and, some believe, on the land itself. This concept, often referred to as stone tape theory, suggests that intense emotions, grief, fear, pain, can leave a kind of psychic imprint on the physical world. Sites of mass trauma, like plague pits and quarantined villages, are thought to carry these imprints, manifesting in strange phenomena centuries later. One compelling example comes from Orvieto, Italy, where a medieval mass grave was unearthed beneath a vineyard. Local residents reported that the area had long been avoided due to whispers of ghostly wails at night. While skeptics dismiss these claims, others argue that the sheer scale of death and despair embedded in the soil has created a lasting echo of those who perished. Similarly, in London, urban legends persist about areas like Smithfield Market, where plague victims were buried en masse. Workers in nearby buildings describe unexplained chills, shadows that seem to move without cause, and the faint scent of decay. Whether these experiences are real or imagined, they reflect a deeper truth. Places marked by profound suffering retain a presence, one that refuses to fade with time. The Black Death may have passed into history, but its shadow lingers, woven into the stories we tell, the the fears we hold and the myths we shape. Themes born from plague years, the inevitability of death, the fragility of life, and the blurred boundary between the living and the dead, continue to haunt folklore and horror culture. These echoes remind us that the plague was not only a catastrophe of the body, but a wound to the soul, one that still festers in the collective imagination. In folklore, the plague lives on as a grim teacher, its lessons etched into the ghost stories and supernatural tales that have survived centuries. One enduring theme is the concept of contagion, not just physical but spiritual. In countless legends, the touch of the plague becomes a metaphor for moral or supernatural corruption, spreading like an unstoppable curse. Ghostly figures of the infected appear in tales across Europe, spectral reminders of the disease's indiscriminate reach. These spirits, often depicted as pallid and shadowy, carry with them not just death but despair, a warning to the living to remember the fragility of their existence. The archetype of the White Lady, who mourns for her lost children, has evolved into countless iterations in modern ghost stories. She is no longer confined to plague pits but roams bridges, abandoned buildings and forests, her grief universal. Her sorrow, born from the mass tragedies of the past, has become a symbol of loss that transcends time. Similarly, spectral plague doctors, with their bird-like masks, have entered modern horror as harbingers of doom. Their eerie presence, blending history with fantasy, speaks to our continued fascination with the plague's dark imagery. The plague has also shaped our understanding of haunted spaces. Sites of mass death, whether from disease, war, or natural disaster, are imbued with the same aura of unease as plague pits. Modern haunted houses and horror films draw on this concept, turning spaces marked by tragedy into locations where the past refuses to rest. The trope of the cursed house or the haunted village owes much to the legacy of the Black Death, where real-life suffering transformed landscapes into sites of supernatural fear. In literature and cinema, the influence of the plague is unmistakable. Works like Albert Camus' The Plague and Daniel Defoe's The Journal of the Plague Year examine not just the disease, but its psychological toll, exploring themes of isolation, mortality, and the collapse of societal norms. Horror films, from The Mask of the Red Death to 28 Days Later, echo the same fears of contagion and death's relentless approach, reflecting a cultural memory rooted in medieval pandemics. Even contemporary zombie stories, with their themes of infection and apocalyptic collapse, can trace their lineage back to plague folklore, where the dead walk again and the infected threaten to consume the living. This persistent imagery speaks to a fundamental truth. The Black Death reshaped the way humanity views itself, embedding fear into the collective psyche. The stories we tell now, though modern in their settings and characters, still carry the same anxieties that plagued the medieval mind. Anxieties born of uncertainty, helplessness, and the relentless march of death. While the Black Death gave rise to chilling tales and spectral warnings, it also revealed humanity's remarkable ability to find meaning amid chaos. Communities that endured the plague did not simply mourn, they created. They turned their fear into myths, their grief into stories, crafting a narrative to explain the incomprehensible, and in doing so, laying the groundwork for resilience. Folklore, too, played a vital role in processing the trauma of the plague. Tales of spectral guardians, like the spirits said to watch over Eyam's plague boundary stones, offered comfort and hope. These stories suggested that even in the face of unimaginable loss, the dead could protect the living, their presence a source of strength rather than fear. Legends of villages surviving because of supernatural intervention or divine mercy reinforced the belief that survival was not just chance, but proof of favour or resilience. Music and ritual also became outlets for coping. Songs lamenting the plague or invoking protection from future outbreaks spread across Europe, their melodies blending grief with defiance. Rituals, from mass blessings to folk traditions meant to ward off death, became acts of community healing. In Italy, the ringing of church bells during outbreaks was believed to drive away malevolent spirits, a practice that continued long after the plague's retreat. Such customs, though rooted in fear, gave people a sense of agency in an otherwise uncontrollable world. Over time, these acts of resilience evolved into traditions that still resonate today. Christmas caroling, for instance, has roots in wassailing, a custom once used to bless homes and fields during the harsh winter months, often in response to plague fears. The themes of renewal, hope, and communal support that emerged during the plague years remain embedded in many of the celebrations and stories we carry forward, even when their origins have been forgotten. The enduring legacy of the Black Death in folklore is not just one of fear and darkness, but also of survival and meaning. The myths and stories born of this catastrophe served as a way for the living to reclaim power over death, to find light in the shadows of despair. They remind us that even in the face of unimaginable loss, humanity has always sought to persevere, not by forgetting but by remembering, and by shaping those memories into something that could be carried forward. The Black Death, a plague that turned life to ash and hope to shadow, may belong to the history books, but its presence is far from silent. The echoes of those dark years persist, carried on the whispers of ghost stories, etched into the lore of cursed lands, and conjured anew in the flickering light of horror films. It is as if the collective trauma of those who lived and died during that time refuses to be forgotten, haunting not just the lands they once walked, but the very stories we tell ourselves about mortality and the mysteries beyond. Even today, we walk on the same soil that held their grief. The plague pits and abandoned villages, the spectral figures and haunted ruins. They remind us that history leaves traces deeper than any written record. These remnants challenge us to ask, do the past's terrors truly fade, or do they linger embedded in the fabric of our shared existence, waiting to be rediscovered? The COVID-19 pandemic brought many of these ancient fears surging back to the surface. The same stories of isolation, fear, and loss that shaped the medieval imagination began to find new relevance in a world suddenly forced to reckon with its own fragility. Empty streets in once bustling cities, masks that became symbols of protection and division, and a global population unified by uncertainty, all of it echoed the scars left by the Black Death. Parallels abounded. During the pandemic, misinformation spread like wildfire, much like the rumours that fueled scapegoating during the plague. Medieval Europe blamed witches and Jews. Today, the culprits shifted to conspiracy theories about shadowy elites or the supposed origin of the virus. The human need to find a cause to pinpoint a villain persists across centuries. These fears, shaped by both the unknown and the uncontrollable, remind us that pandemics are not just biological events. They are deeply human experiences, pulling at the same psychological threads that bound medieval minds. The imagery of death also returned, though modern and sanitized. Refrigerated trucks became makeshift morgues, replacing the mass graves of the past but evoking the same sense of overwhelming loss. Hospitals, overwhelmed and stretched to their limits, mirrored the chaos of medieval infirmaries. The sight of healthcare workers clad in layers of protective gear became a contemporary equivalent to the beaked plague doctors of old, a symbol of both hope and fear, humanity's best effort to stave off an unstoppable force. But pandemics also have a way of inspiring resilience, and the stories that arise from them are as much about survival as they are about death. The myths of the Black Death, of restless spirits and cursed lands, served a purpose, giving shape to fear that otherwise defied expression. These tales became shared experiences, a way to process collective trauma and find meaning in the senseless. Today, the art, literature, and films emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic serve a similar function, exploring themes of isolation, connection, and hope in the face of despair. In many ways, these stories resonate so deeply because they tap into something primal, a memory encoded in our collective unconscious. Carl Jung described the collective unconscious as a reservoir of shared human experience, where archetypes like the Grim Reaper or the Mourning White Lady emerge, shaped by centuries of human fear and resilience. These symbols transcend time, reappearing whenever humanity is confronted by its own mortality. The plague stories and imagery are not just relics of the past. They are reflections of truths we still carry, whispered across generations. Perhaps this is why, even now, the spectre of the Black Death lingers. It serves as a reminder of our vulnerability, but also our strength, of the darkness we have endured and the light we have fought to preserve. The parallels between then and now are stark, not because history repeats itself exactly, but because the same forces, fear, hope, resilience, are always at play. The Black Death was a chapter of unimaginable loss, but it also gave birth to myths, legends, and questions that transcend time. Perhaps it's not merely ghosts that haunt these stories, but the unresolved yearning of a humanity desperate to make sense of its own fragility. The spectre of the plague stands as a reminder: the past is never fully buried, and its shadows will always find a way to touch the present.